Okay, good evening. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, bienvenidos. On behalf of the Baker Institute's Latin America Initiative and its Vecinos lecture series, I'd like to welcome you to this evening discussion on security in Central America. I would like to extend a special thanks to the Council of the Americas, which is the co-host for this evening, and we're particularly grateful to Christopher Sabatini and Richard Andre, who helped put together this remarkable group of speakers. Dr. Sabatini will also moderate our panel tonight. Security is a topic that captures headlines every day. And when you think of security here in the United States, for the most part, your thoughts probably turn to terrorists and the tragic events of September 11. In Latin America, and in Central America in particular, thoughts of security take a different form. They go from drug lords and gangs to a lack of trust in critical institutions like local police forces and the judiciary. Central America's not-so-distant past, which also includes years of armed conflict, military dictators, high poverty rates, huge income disparity, also contribute to today's security problems in the region. The Northern Triangle, which consists of El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, is one of the most violent regions in the world today. In 2010, in terms of homicide rates, there were 39 murders per 100,000 people in Guatemala, 71 murders per 100,000 people in El Salvador, and 86 murders per 100,000 people in Honduras. Compare this with Mexico, which we hear plenty of in the news, that that has 18 homicides per 100,000. The United States has 5, and Chile 1. We tend to mostly attribute the security problems in the region to drug trafficking. And yes, Central America is geographically located between the most important producers of coca to the south and their largest consumer to the north. So yes, drug traffickers play a huge role in the equation. However, so do the maras, or gangs, which one of our experts will tell us more about in a minute. And so does everyday delinquency caused by lack of opportunities and jobs, as well as the lack of trust in institutions. That trust is critical for a sense of security within the population. Governments, the private sector, and civil society organizations are taking important steps in tackling the security problems in the region. This is no doubt a pressing issue not only for Central America, but for the whole region. Today, we have a remarkable group of experts who will help us understand the complex scenario of security in Central America. We are honored to have with us tonight Eduardo Stein, former Vice President of Guatemala, Thomas Ward, Associate Professor of Anthropology at the University of Southern California, and Virginia Trujillo, Director of Communication and External Relations at AES El Salvador. Our panelists bring important insights from government, the private sector, and society in general. Please refer to your programs for further details on their bios. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome our guests.
Thank you. As a moderator, I'll remain seated, and I'll leave it up to the speakers whether they want to stand or sit. And also, Dr. Stein, with your permission, I'm going to reverse the order of the panel to have us go in this issue and have you speak last. Is that okay? Good.
By all means.
Good. Well, welcome all of you. I want to thank you for coming. This is the result of a plan that Erica and I had about a year ago when I was here visiting, and we planned to start collaborating. I come from an organization called the American Society Council of the Americas in New York. That looks at a number of these issues. And one of the things we do is publish a quarterly journal dedicated to Latin America and the Americas more broadly. And in fact, 2 years ago, we published an issue dedicated to narcotics trafficking in the hemisphere. And at the time called it, I still believe this is the case, the greatest threat to democracy, and indeed, certainly in some regions, to the region itself and to the integrity and capacity of states, countries as wide and far away as El Salvador, and also Bolivia and Venezuela and parts of Colombia, even still today. So I'm happy that we could be here to talk about this issue. What we will do is I've posed a set of questions to the panelists, and I'll have Tom speak first to talk a little bit about the maras He was recently doing field research in El Salvador. He's publishing a book on the Maras to give us a really up-close and granular perspective on who they are and their organization, where they fit into the social fabric of El Salvador and how they're changing. Next, I'm going to ask Virginia Torre to talk a little bit about AES.
Okay,
I'm going to have Tom speak first.
He's just going down the list.
I'm just going down the list.
No, I'm going to go first, then you, and then him.
Okay.
He's just
Okay, and then I'm going to ask Virginia to talk a little bit about the role of the private sector, because as Erica said, this is clearly something that can't be addressed alone by governments and states, many of them already weakened by years of civil war and now being outgunned and overrun by transnational criminal syndicates. And then last, I'll have Eduardo Stein talk a little bit from his perspective, not just as the former vice president of Guatemala, but also having served in the Peace Commission in Honduras and done a truly noble job of assessing the situation in Honduras after the 2009 coup, in which, as many could have predicted at the time, the situation has gotten so bad now that Honduras now leads the region in murders per capita. Again, a sad statement about the confluence of economic desperation, political polarization and breakdown, and crime and violence in the hemisphere. So, Tom, I'll have you go first and take us through your presentation and your book.
So to get this started, is there a way we can dim the lights? Is that possible to dim the lights? No? Okay. My PowerPoint is mainly photographs that I took, and a friend of mine who's a professional photographer who covered the Civil War in El Salvador for 8 years and is a professor in the Department of Journalism at University of Texas at Austin. And so I don't know how well you'll be able to see the photographs, but we'll go ahead and continue. So. Oh, I see. Okay. So, so I started gang research in 1993. It was an offshoot of my dissertation research at UCLA on Salvadoran refugees and the problems of adjustment to living in Los Angeles coming from El Salvador. So this is the cover of my book, which will be out in June 1st. It has black and white photographs, drawings from MS gang members in prison, and poetry also that I encouraged and sometimes bribed them to write during the course of my research. The research began in 1993. I spent 8.5 years doing participant observation research, which basically meant hanging out with and spending as much time and observing them in as many different environments as I could. And then subsequently spent another 8 years following them up to find out what happened to them after they got out of the gang. And so this book talks about the origin of MS, how it got started in Los Angeles, and tracks 5 of these gang members from the time that they got into the gang until after they got out. The first comment I want to make is with all the media representations of the gang, one might think that it is a international criminal conspiracy. And even though it is a transnational gang, its various cliques in Canada, United States, Mexico, and Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador are not closely connected. And the connections that are made are usually on personal basis and not as part of some criminal conspiracy. The title of my book refers not so much about the movement of individuals across boundaries, but about the marginalization, the rebelliousness of these individuals that knows no bounds, and the sense of psychological identity that also doesn't have borders. So my focus of the research was with the hardcore members. And I'll talk more about that in just a minute, the difference between hardcore, core, and peripheral gang members. So the background, you can't, because of the lightness, you can't really see. But the background, of course, these were all individuals who were born in El Salvador, grew up during the Civil War, which lasted from 1980 to 1992. I write about the trauma and cycle of violence. All of these individuals had seen decapitated bodies, body parts, sometimes people being killed in front of them. And so that experience of early childhood socialization to violence somewhat inured them and prepared them later on for the hardcore gangster life. This is a poem that one of the gang members, I'll just read the English version, and if you want to read the Spanish, you can. Born to kill, who says that we are born to kill? The corpses tell us that we are born to die. So you can see that one of the common elements of hardcore gang members is a sense of fatalistic perspective on life, that their life is a misery and the future does not hold much promise. There's also the question of survivor's guilt and grief for loss of family members and friends, family dislocation. Some of these individuals had been displaced several times within El Salvador before being illegally smuggled into the United States. This is a drawing by a MS gang member who's in Pelican Bay State Prison, which is in the uppermost northern part of California. And it's a drawing just with pen, ballpoint pen, and it's hard to see the detail, but he's an amazing artist with no formal training. And this is he was in a relocation camp in El Salvador, and this is a drawing that he did of a young girl holding her baby brother. Of course, deportation to Central America was the reason for the spread of the gangs in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. Beginning in the mid-1990s, INS, or the Immigration Naturalization Service, started deporting people with any kind of criminal history, and they were particularly looking for anybody with affiliations to street gangs as a way of, in a sense, passing the buck on to another country. So the maras, which they are now called, originally in El Salvador they were called pandillas, or street gangs. Because of the advent of Mara Salvatrucha and Mara 18, or the 18th Street Gang, both of which started in Los Angeles, they now refer to the street gangs as maras. The revolving door. So it has been documented that not large numbers, but some gang members not only are deported back, but do eventually find their way back into the United States. So if the United States government believes that they are getting rid of the problem permanently, they're sadly mistaken. So R&R in and out of prison. For hardcore gang members, a prison can sometimes be a rest from the rigors of gang life. Prison is also a finishing school for crime, so we cannot use incarceration as a way of rehabilitation because, in fact, people that are sent to prison, and this has been documented in El Salvador, some people who are very loosely affiliated to the gang become more affiliated once they spend some time in prison. Getting jumped in is the typical way of becoming initiated into a street gang. I'm an anthropologist, so I teach a class on street gangs at USC. And so from the anthropological perspective, the gang initiation is both a military test and a ritual sacrifice. It's to prove that you are down for the gang and you're willing to make sacrifices. So MS started in LA in the late 1970s. Originally it was MSS, or Mara Salvatrucha Stoners. It was a gang that was devoted to listening to heavy metal music, smoking marijuana, and going into these rock concerts and smashing into each other. So the history of how the book documents how it transferred or transmogrified from MSS to MS, but I don't have time to go to that. So some of the issues about joining the gang, I'm not going to go read through the list because I want to keep this brief and leave it open for questions. But culture shock, learning a new language, the stigma of being an illegal alien, all of these things played a role in their reasons to join. Also, some kids who are quite young think that the gang is fun. They also join for friendship. And Killing Time is the name of the next book that I'm working on, which is a double entendre for both trying to get rid of boredom, but also the pernicious aspects of street gangs. So this is just one of the gang members in Los Angeles. who had joined. So the gang literature talks about differences between hardcore versus peripheral gang members. You don't really hear this in the media, but not all gang members are alike. There are some people who will join a gang and a year later they will be out of the gang and they will have no criminal record. The worst thing they ever did was maybe spray paint their name on a wall. And so it's important when we talk about gang members not to lump them all together and assume that they're all hardcore. I also talk about female gang members on the margins of masculinity. It's particularly difficult for women who are in gangs. And these are some of the issues that I've listed here that I address in the book. Some of the double standards that the street gang has for women. Becoming calmado. So calmado is a term for retirement or becoming calmed down. And for those who survive the gang life, who don't end up in prison for life or in the grave, and that's the majority of them, they eventually calm down and retire from the gang life. So what does it mean to be calmado? It means starting over, starting families, and starting new lives. It's particular, you can't really see in this picture, but this particular ex-gang member is holding his baby girl, and he has tattoos, which you see on the cover of my book, across his forehead, which basically, and there's no tattoo removal available for him, and so it makes him a pariah in his society, and most places he's not allowed to go. It makes starting over particularly difficult. Really the only recognized legitimate exit from the street, from MS and 18th Street in El Salvador is the evangelical church. And they will, once somebody makes the conversion, they will investigate and make sure that you're staying on the straight and narrow, which means no drinking, no smoking, no womanizing, no gambling, et cetera, and that you're going every night to the church to pray. So questions of rehabilitation and reinsertion is something that obviously we have to look at. Redemption for some ends up in the grave, but for most, there's also the question of grief and guilt that those who do exit the gang have to deal with. And so we have to look at questions beyond incarceration, because as I say, most people don't end up in prison, don't end up in the grave, and so we have to look at ways of how we can rehabilitate and reinsert them into society. So those are all my pictures.
Presentation. Okay. Thank you. Let me turn next to Virginia, and I'll give both of the speakers, they can stay at the table or speak from the podium, whichever they like, to get the perspective of the private sector. Having worked on this issue, and we're working on this ourselves, the American Society in El Salvador, the private sector must play a larger role, both in stepping up in these situations and investing and driving economic growth. But many of these countries are caught in a vicious circle. Investment, hiring, expansion are contingent upon senses of security in the future within these countries. And so there's this risk of low GDP growth because of low investment, low rates of hiring, that make it difficult for these economies to absorb the influx of these large entrants to the labor markets. So I'm curious, Virginia, from the perspective, and I know EES has done a lot of really leading edge work on this in El Salvador. How do you see, how much does insecurity and violence affect your businesses, or generally the private sector's interest in sort of expanding and investing and hiring people?
Okay, as we have said just before, Latin America is the world's most violent region in the world nowadays, and Central America is the most of all. And in Latin America and the Caribbean, we have 80% of the population worldwide, and 31% of all the homicides occur there. So we have a very important situation to face. Of course, insecurity threatens the health, the physical integrity, and affects also the integrity of the companies and the states. Violence is a result of multiple factors. Could it be lack of education, isolation, and high level of poverty, which is something that we can see undoubtedly in Central America. So we think that we have to work in sustainable efforts, and that has to do, of course, to fight against this with education, with health, with social protection, with, try to take these people and become, bringing them better quality of life. And this is important because if the people, if I'm talking as a company, if the people have better quality of life, but they can afford things, companies can be better and state could be in progress. So the only thing that one company, a private company, has to take on account when it's going to invest in a country is not only the security. There are many other factors that could be quality of labor, it could be juridical security, geographical location. Many other things are taken on account when you are going to invest in a country. But as we have said, of course, if the country goes better, everybody goes better. And I am representing the electrical sector, which has a very complex situation in those cases because, for example, we in AES in El Salvador, we have 80% of the market, of the distribution market in energy. What it says is that we are spread almost in the whole country, and our investments are more than 30,000 kilometers of lines, thousands of meters of transformers, substations. So we cannot say, okay, let's close the door and tomorrow and let's go. We have our investment is there and has to be there. We can't take this and go away. So we have to work on this. Also, other problem that we face is that we, as a distribution company, we are regulated by the state. So it means that we have to invest even though there are those problems in the country because it is in the law and we have to do it, and we have penalties if we don't bring the quality of power, for example, that we have to bring to the population. So what we think about this, okay, we are in the country, we are committed with the country, and we need to work to fight against the violence, against the poverty, because this is the way our business will grow up as well.
Great. Do you want to say anything a little bit about what AES is doing? I know you're in terms of public-private partnerships. I mean, what works? If you can just sort of, I asked her questions on Friday, and I said I was going to keep more of a discussion format here. So I just skip ahead a little bit on what before Vice President Stein speaks about what AES is doing and what you've discovered works in these, so that this isn't all gloom and doom from the perspective of Central America and what we confront. That there are in fact initiatives that are having an effect.
Yes, we have two ways of collaborate with this fight against violence. One of it is we have public-private partnerships with the Trust for the Americas, and we have also this with the Millennium Challenge Corporation. So we have developed some important projects that are looking forward to different things, and it's usually what the companies could do. One thing is to work in your own business, and it is what we are developing, for example, with MCC. We are bringing rural electrification to. We have done this since 2000. Before with government agencies. And 34,000 families have nowadays electricity because of this partnership. And also we are doing something similar with the MCC. And in 2012, this year, we are finishing a very important project that is to bring electricity to the northern zone of San Salvador. And it was chosen because it's the poorest area in San Salvador. So when we are bringing electricity, we are sure we are bringing opportunities. But also we have another projects for, like for example, the one that we have with Trust for the Americas. We have developed, we are sponsoring a program that they call Poeta. And we have a Poeta in El Salvador, in Dominican Republic, Panama, Colombia, and Chile. And what it does is to prepare they catch the youth at risk. They usually put their offices in places where the risk is high, and they call the youth that is in risk, and they start to prepare them for looking for a job in very basic things. For example, has to do with technology, has to do with manage a computer, has to do with values, to think that that can bring them a first step to start in a new job, to start a new life. And in the partnership that we have with Trust for the Americas, we have also developed our own programs there. We know, for example, what are the kind of jobs that we are demanding from the society, and we develop a program, and these people, these young people, is prepared in this training so they can help us and bring us their work. So this is basically the examples that we have.
Great, very nice. I think an indication that everyone can have a role to play in reconstructing the social fabric in these terribly difficult places. Dr. Stein, perspective. Yes, you may go. Speak from the podium.
Sometimes I get carried away and I don't want to bump into. In the introduction, Erika referred to the type of statistic that the United Nations agencies use in calculating the weight of homicides within a society. And they measure it by homicide per 100,000 inhabitants. And she quoted the fact that Mexico, although it's in the forefront of the news because it's neighboring the United States, has only 18 homicides per 100,000 inhabitants, whereas Guatemala borders 40, Salvador is over 60, and Honduras close to 86. But we from Central America have other ways of looking at this type of daily statistics. Between Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, we're putting up 44 violent deaths per day. And that is why some of us, for at least 3.5 years, started to press on the need to discuss regionally the onslaught that our countries were going through in terms of the extreme development of narcotic activities, but in general, organized crime in the Isthmus, which started about 5 years ago to incremental dimensions that we hadn't seen before. Someone also made, I think it was Erika in the introduction, made reference to our internal war years in the recent past. At least in Guatemala, Salvador, and Nicaragua, we had internal armed conflicts. And I would like to make reference to another type of statistic. In Guatemala proper, the Truth Commission documented close to 200,000 people dead and disappeared during the 36-year internal armed conflict. I do not know the data of the U.S. Civil War, but if compared those statistics in the late 80s, early 90s to the population within the United States, you would have lost 33 million people in 36 years. So that is the type of proportions that we are dealing with when we try to envision policies that can indeed bring the countries together into action, plans, projects, procedures, and general shared policies that are indeed the reflection of co-responsibility. We don't exactly know why the US administration did not want to discuss this before the Cartagena summit. Of course, we have our personal positions, group opinions. We might get into this during the question and answer period. But something is certain for us in Central America. There is no way our countries alone, or even the 7 countries put together, can measure up to the capacity of organized crime working in the Isthmus. It needs the involvement, the active involvement of the producing countries of the Andean area of Latin America, that is Colombia, Venezuela, Peru, Ecuador, and Bolivia. And Colombia has shown very concrete actions of involvement and shared responsibility with the Isthmus, as well as Mexico and the United States being the largest consuming market of drugs all over the world. Why is this shared responsibility so important for us? Well, because from a Latin American perspective, we have not indeed found yet the way in which we can combine domestic responsibilities in societies that have weak institutions, but we are convinced we have to do our own domestic homework, and a regional perspective to counter this not only violence, but the operational aspects of organized crime in the region. Partly because we are a very unequal region. Latin America has 10 of the 15 most unequal countries in the world. So there is a lot of concentration of wealth, power, capacity, and decision-making processes in very few, and large amounts of population which do not receive the public services that our constitutions task the government with giving its own population. But if you combine this inequality and this lack of efficiency in the attention to the population from the point of view of the government, you also see that the weight of the insecurity that our societies live puts an enormous burden on any structure, financial or otherwise, and an enormous burden in private enterprises. The generation, therefore, of job opportunities, of income in general, of wealth in our societies is constantly obstructed by the weight of this violence that needs to be countered. According to the World Bank, in 2010, which are the figures that we have at our disposal, violence cost Central America 7.7% of our GDP, 10% in Honduras, and 11% of our GDP in Salvador. What does it mean then, in comparative terms, with the capacities of the state and those of organized crime? one of the conundrums we have is that in a certain way, the consequences of these criminal activities in the region also places a complex set of weakening processes in our own institutions. To put it in another way, the wealth that these illegal operations generate in order to be disfrutadas, enjoyed by those who generated them, they need to go into the system and to be cleansed or laundered. So money laundering is also another aspect which deviates a lot of the institutional health that we need to construct and need to strengthen into a constant weakening of our institutional scaffolding. I would like to spend a couple of minutes in trying to explain this, although in a highly simplified fashion, to follow up on what this entailed. Last year, the Central American network of think tanks that we coordinate decided to make a policy paper studying not only the violence which comes on a daily basis in our daily press, but to try to get at the mechanisms that organized crime uses in the region. And what we found was a highly sophisticated bundle of illegal practices that infects public and private institutions. Because in order for them to guarantee the corridors of impunity for their illegal activities, they have to corrupt public authorities, but also they have to create private institutions that take care of operational aspects of the transit of whatever they are trying to get through Central America up to the northern markets, as well as the money laundering activities to put all these fabulous illegal income of their criminal activities into legal pathways in the financial system. What we also learned is that Central America ceased to be only a corridor of illegality. We had narco activities before for many years because of our geography. But starting 6 or 5 years ago, with an incremental dimension that we had never seen before, what we saw is that Central America gradually became also a warehouse for the transiting of whatever was in illegal activities, not only drug, but also people, also contraband, also endangered biological species, also our own cultural pre-Columbian and colonial treasures that needed structures of servicing throughout the corridor. So now Central America has become like a huge service station for illegality. It's like a gigantic 7-Eleven for all of the criminal organizations. There is one of the members of the think tank network that made a study of bordering communities between Colombia and Panama, between Panama and Costa Rica, and between Costa Rica and Nicaragua. They're about to start the Northern Triangle part of the same study, and they did indeed find that these populations in these villages, these neighboring villages in the border, have indeed become a service station type of community. Just to give you one single example, Panama has a tiny town of barely 2,000 people in the border with Colombia called Jaque. By the way, during the Second World War, there was a U.S. military airstrip there, which is now used by other people. And, and this town of Jaque has a type of bars or entertainment centers with female company included, pretty much what happened in Cartagena with the Secret Service people, that brings together a lot of very high, very expensive type of servicing for the people who transfer there, as well as the warehousing needed, as well as the capillarity that the population bring to many of the movement of these illegal goods, whether drug, people, contraband, etc. So much so that in the case of Nicaragua, the police wanted to stop one of these huge operations in a bordering town near the Atlantic or the Caribbean Ocean, and the population themselves organized with armed capacity to resist the police, because their livelihood depend on the cartels, much more so than in whatever governmental capacity is present or absent, or whatever legal economic activity is undertaken around them. So the organized crime or the narco cartels are not only stronger and swifter because they have no legal barriers, but they have institutionalized as a regular and habitual power in the economy, in politics, and in social agendas that threatens the very institutionality and stability of our democratic states. At least this is the case in Honduras, in Guatemala, and in El Salvador. Panama, which was very proud of being totally a part of this type of infection, from 2006 to 2010, the volume of homicides per 100,000 inhabitants duplicated from 11 to 23, which makes Panama the country of fastest growth of percent of homicides in all of Latin America. So no one is free from this type of infection. So money laundering, as the end result, has a demolishing, corruptive power in our societies and in our institutions. I'm going to take the last few minutes just to point to some recommendations that we made to the governments, a few of which have already been undertaken. One is to follow the money trail. If we need to do something about these things, we have to start with their gains. And in an effort, an all-out effort that needs to be regional, at making all of these routes of the money as transparent as we could, we need the collaboration of the US financial system. Because another thing we found is that the largest plaza, the largest market for money laundering is in the US banking system. Secondly, in following the control of the mechanisms for legitimation of capitals derived from these illegal activities, we have a very complex dilemma in Central America to solve, and we don't know how. Because we have realized that within our borders, the free flow of people has been happening for many years so far, even before the conquest times. And it was unfair to place the weight of border controls and migratory controls to people who make their own living out of these facilities. The same is true with the movement of commerce. We signed free trade agreements amongst ourselves with the United States and with Mexico, and 2 years ago with the European Union countries, which will come in effect by mid-year 2012. So how can we put together the freedom of movement that merchandise and people need in order to develop our own regional economies, and at the same time put in place the controls needed to try to stop, and if possible, to reduce the activities of organized crime in the region? Well, one way is transparency, but also accountability. We also found that one of the most terrible cancers we have in our societies is corruption. And we need to address these issues in a very swift way, but also we need to make enormous efforts at homogeneity in our legislation. We need to modernize our laws, but also to make them of such a nature compatible that indeed we can work as a group of countries with single lines of actions that are effective transborderly. A third element of the recommendations, I won't go into the detail, is of course to modernize our institutions, beginning with the police. The police in Honduras and in Guatemala are one of the most corrupt institutions we have, and according to the experts that are helping us in this reform, both from the United States, from Chile, from Spain, and from Colombia, they consider that modernizing and transforming that type of institutions takes more than 10 years. Well, maybe institutionally we should work on that medium-term and long-term horizon, but we need to produce results in a very short term, which comes to the last item I wanted to mention, and that is the involvement of the Army in public security issues. That is a very complicated theme in Central America. But governments, when they face the corruption and the incapacity of their police forces, they tend to reach out to the Army, because the Army is a body that has a lot more discipline than any police force, and that have the previous experience of military combat. Well, the decision, of course, we respect the authorities that maybe in a desperate situation take those decisions or make those decisions, but they're based on two false premises. One is that indeed, because of their training, they are going to be more effective in countering the narcotic cartels. And secondly, that only the police force is prone to corruption and the Army isn't. We have many examples on the contrary. Once an army that is accustomed to live in secluded areas, in forts, in military installations, get in touch through an everyday life activity with populations infested with members of the cartels, they are prone to corruption as well. And when you see the level of salaries that all of the justice system personnel gets, that all of the military and the police force gets, as compared to the kind of money that the cartels wield on a daily basis, you see that the options are not that favorable. Fortunately, though, the population is responding in a very constructive and very positive way, which are beginning to show signs of a competent countering of some of these issues in the areas that I mentioned and in other areas. So it's not such a gloomy perspective. Thank you very much.
Thank you for ending on a glimmer of hope, Dr. Stein. With that, let me open it up for questions from the audience. And one hand shot up really quickly.
Yeah, Mr. Vice President Stein, would you say that has been a failure of the leadership in those countries, I mean, in the countries of Central America and by extension, the countries of Latin America?
You want me to react? As a true Jesuit priest would say, yes and no. There has been indeed a failure, not only of the topmost leaders in the countries, but I would say that the political party system has not lived up to what the population is expecting. Matter of fact, in at least El Salvador, Honduras, and Guatemala, which are the countries that I know the best, political parties have been drifting away from the population and the representation tasks that by law they are giving. But also the magnitude and complexity of these transnational problems is such that we cannot take the blame alone for this. It is a much wider geographical responsibility that we have to look at.
Let's go right over there.
Question for Mr. Stein. I'm from Honduras, so I'm from those 80-something numbers. First of all, thank you for helping us with our political crisis back 2 years
Welcome.
ago. My question is, what's your position on decriminalization of drugs, and why is that something that we cannot, I mean, of course the U.S. does not like to think about that, but it seems to be like, at some point, one of the most important things to address in this problem.
I don't want to chicken out of your question. I think it's a very fundamental one. But I want to ask for your indulgence. It would take me a few minutes to try to explain the implications of what was and is at stake regionally, and perhaps we should allow for other topics to come, but I'll get back to that question in a very frontal way.
Okay.
Okay, good. Let's go.
I was wondering if we could get some perspective on Costa Rica and Belize on the same sub-issues.
Okay. Does anyone, let's turn to the whole panel on Costa Rica and Belize. Dr. Stein, why don't we start with you, and then if anyone else wants to add some.
Well, Costa Rica has seen also an increment in criminality, and they are quite worried about it. And since they do not have an army, they do not have a temptation of resort to an army, but they have enhanced their police force to numbers and equipment that can be more effective in the fight against the cartels. The problem is that no country alone can make progress if the neighboring ones do not act in pretty much the same way. And Costa Rica has a very unsavory neighbor called Nicaragua. And they, however, because of their peculiar history, have the lowest percentage of homicides and the lowest recurrence of criminal activities of the entire region. That a few years ago, was enough to make us re-examine a standard thesis that criminal violence was directly associated with poverty, because Nicaragua is the poorest, together with Honduras, of the countries in Central America, and yet Honduras has the highest homicide rate, Nicaragua the lowest. The problem with Costa Rica, though, is that the policies are never, they don't coincide, and they are never harmonizable because of the Nicaraguan government being reluctant to give way to regionalized commitments which entail the loss of central authority from Daniel Ortega. And we've seen what has happened in the last two electoral processes in Nicaragua that has impinged upon the neighbors, both in Honduras and Costa Rica. The other element in Costa Rica is that because of the way in which their investment structures in tourism were designed, which favored foreign investment and favored the retirement of elder people from Europe, the United States, in very favorable terms, they were subject to what I would say a financial attack on disguised retirees in the tourist industry, and now they are trying to stiffen their legislation in terms of tax evasion procedures, controls, as well as other mechanisms, which places Costa Rica in a different echelon. And another element is that they have had such a formidable social policy throughout decades that the level of education and healthcare in Costa Rica is by far superior to the rest of the countries. So Costa Rica, in theory, would be in a much better shape to counter this onslaught, but they cannot do it alone. We have such porous borders that the situation of citizen insecurity keeps deteriorating in Costa Rica. I cannot talk about Belize, honestly, because I don't know the internal situation there well.
Do any of the other panelists want to add anything in terms of?
Well, my expertise is on street gangs. Costa Rica doesn't have much of a problem, but Belize does. Both Bloods and Crips sets have been found in Costa Rica, and it's a similar situation to what's happened in Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador with deportations of people back to Belize. But the problems aren't nearly as severe as they are in Honduras and El Salvador, Guatemala.
It seems to me that the big elephant in the room, in this room, which has been implied but not talked about expressly really, is the huge role of the United States. You've talked about it a little bit in terms of money laundering following the trail, but I would be very interested in what the four of you think, maybe leaving aside legalization of drugs, as this gentleman said, if you want to, but what we should do. Because we're the genesis of this in a very real sense. We're the demand center. The gangs you talk about come out of Los Angeles to a large extent. We have created in our country perhaps the illusion, perhaps the reality that we can't close down stores that sell guns because it's unconstitutional, which is still a very questionable issue. I'd like sort of a no-holds-barred. You've been incessantly polite, it seems to me. But no-holds-barred approach as to what we, as private citizens and as formulators of public policy, can do in this country.
I'll start quickly. It's an issue that I've worked on, and then since I want to give Dr. Stein a chance to take a breath. It's a good question, and I do think what's happened in the last 3 years with President Obama is that you see a growing recognition of the United States' responsibility in the drug consumption and the drug corruption and violence that we see now stretching literally now from the Southern Cone all the way up to the Rio Grande. But that really hasn't been met with any real concrete changes. Several things I would put on the table have to be done, and I will actually address the drug legalization thing right now. So don't want to abuse my time, my role as a moderator. I think it's too much of a silver bullet. I mean, I think it's
Silver bullet.
silver bullet. The idea it can just solve problems.
Panacea.
Panacea. It shifts the debate away from things that should perhaps be, and there are merits in it, but there are also problems in it in terms of just the complexity. Which drugs are you going to legalize? How will they be legalized? Will you allow, how are you going to allow the marketing of, say, marijuana and cocaine? How will it be sold? Will it be licensed? Who's going to sell it? Imagine if cocaine that was produced were sold and marketed by the same people who make U.S. spirits. I mean, can you imagine the power of the cocaine and marijuana that'd be on the market if Anheuser-Busch could get its hands on it and test it and refine it and sell it, and how that would be marketed? I mean, there are a welter of questions here that we're not addressing seriously. I'm not saying it's not an option, but I think we need to think about, untangle all the different aspects of criminalization, decriminalization, or legalization, and what that means. And I don't think we're really looking at it seriously. I respect the need for Latin American countries to use this as a prod to the United States to basically begin to take their demands and their concerns and their dire situation seriously, but I don't think it's an answer. Certainly not as it's presented. I do think there are several things that we have fallen down on. One is coordination. We are not coordinating with the countries as a bloc, as a region, with European Union countries, not just in terms of providing assistance, but also in terms of intelligence gathering, providing the sorts of financial transparency that is required. Yes, the U.S. banks laundered money. Yes, our own border controls can contribute to it. Yes, our immigration policies. We just simply haven't owned up to that. The second is treating more and more drug abuse in the United States as a healthcare issue. We treat it as a law enforcement issue. And the truth is, just if you look at the numbers, in the United States, it costs $40,000 a year to incarcerate one man. And as Tom said, and this is not just unique to El Salvador, incarceration has wiped out entire generations of poor families and has turned them in many cases to hardened criminals. It costs only $15,000 a year to treat someone for substance abuse. Economically, it makes no sense, and in terms of the recidivism rates that we see, it makes no sense. And we just simply have not addressed this effectively as a health control problem. Instead, we kick the can down the road, and we're forcing governments throughout Latin America to militarize their policies to respond to a healthcare problem, a demand problem we have on this issue. The third area is immigration. And I don't think we've addressed this effectively as an immigration issue. We tend to return people, passing again the problem to their domestic systems. And last, I would also say, in the terms of the sale of weapons, there are over, I hear last count, 2,000 arms weapons vendors on the U.S.-Mexico border that aren't selling. They're selling semi-automatic weapons, not to hunt armadillos in Texas, but obviously to the market that go down. 90% of the weapons that were captured in Mexico could be traced back to gun merchants in the United States on the Texas, New Mexico, Arizona border. And that's, again, their blood is on the hands of, to be quite frank, and to be very partisan here, the NRA. What should the U.S. do? Dr. Stein?
There has been a change of language in the announcement a few days ago of a new drug policy within the United States. Just of language, which, much to our dismay, we hoped for something bigger or a more advanced formulation. But if we trace back the history of U.S.-Latin American relations, many a times a substantial shift in policy begins with a language shift. So it's not so bad. Secondly, the numbers. The new policy mentions 25 billion that will be dedicated to this shift in treating drug users or drug addicts not any longer just like criminals that will be persecutable by law enforcement authorities, but as patients that have the right to be treated and, if possible, do away with the habit. I am a member of the board of directors of the Inter-American Dialogue, and when we heard this, we immediately called Washington and asked our colleagues there what this meant, because it was an enormous amount of money. And they said that it is not fresh money, it's no new money. There are funds that are already there, allocated to different issues that will be reallocated or redirected or more concentrated to these tasks. Again, it's not so bad, because if there is a sharper focus within, then the dialogue between the United States and Latin America will be better focused. One of the problems we found just a few months ago is that the US government is so complex, and there are so many institutions that, although they abide by federal law and oversight, they do their own agendas and they play their own music, and they sometimes contradict each other. And this happened in Central America very recently, when the State Department began to drift away from the region with the same type of attention that they provided a few years ago when there was armed conflicts in all of the region. That void was immediately occupied by the Defense Department, the US Defense Department. So it was an awkward situation for us that the foreign policy scaffolding that the U.S. administration was being crafted in the highest levels of authority was not being provided by the diplomatic corps or the diplomatic capacity of the State Department or the Treasury Department or the Commerce Department, as was the case a decade ago, but by the Department of Defense. Why is that? Well, I didn't draft the policy. I don't know why the State Department sort of became somewhat aloof from at least our geography. We understand there were considerable problems in the agenda here, as well as emerging powers like Brazil that needed a different type of dialogue with the United States. But what would the United States do in the near future? We hope, and we have given the signals, that we will indeed start a regional dialogue on different premises. But why were they so reluctant to start right away before the Cartagena summit or at the Cartagena summit? I can only give you an educated guess, which was the question of the person over there. Why hasn't the United States, which is a very complex, as I said, government and a very complex society, addressed the issues that need to be addressed in a more frontal way? One thing that we also learned with our study last year is that drug problems and even drug trafficking is not an important issue for the US voter. It is not. It's not in their radar. So, if you have a bunch of little countries making noise when there shouldn't, right amidst the staging of the electoral campaign, when the Republicans are about to land on a single candidacy, this stirs the water. This was very uncomfortable for Washington. That's one explanation we have. Another thing that is really uncomfortable for us is the absolutely disparaging level of attention that the issue of the Secret Service in Cartagena is getting from the press. We are beginning to have second thoughts if this is not intentional, to hide the failure of other policy issues that couldn't be properly addressed and discussed. And it's just a smokescreen, which of course some press in the US and some press in Latin America are having a ball with it. But indeed, it just, ¿cómo se dice? Enmascara? It masks. It masks the fact that the deepest issues at stake in the agenda, which had been discussed by the foreign ministries for months in preparation to the summit, didn't see the light of day and are shaded by this type of idiotic scandal. So what do we need to do? Readdress the issues and do not leave the agenda to the haphazard interests of some editors.
Horny security officers?
No, we're worried about how the press is handling this, both in Latin America and the US.
Well,
the fact that in the New York Times, in the Washington Post, in Los Angeles Times, what was played to the fore?
Yeah.
None of the central issues of the agenda of the summit, with the exception of Cuba, which was also a blurring element.
I actually just want to add two comments quickly on that. I think one is that I think the fact that the United States arrived at the summit ill-prepared to talk about and direct the agenda reflects a certain element of old think on the part of the United States. Still believing they can drive the agenda, still believing that it can. I mean, the summit was first started in 1994 in Miami. The idea was going to create a union of an agreement, a hemisphere-wide agreement of free trade. And this was driven very much by that. I think that old think still permeates a lot of the U.S.'s preparations for the summit, and I think they got caught flat-footed, rather optimistically believing that it would change. The second is, I can say just from my contacts in the U.S. State Department, they are humiliated by what happened in Cartagena. By no means are the people that I know and speak to, and I've been sort of running, people have been calling me for comments and quotes on it. I talked to the State Department, they're humiliated by what happened. They've spent months developing an agenda and trying to promote it, and they are just apoplectic that the group of rogue officers in the Secret Service completely stole the light away from this. So I don't actually think it's a smokescreen. I think it's actually just a complete bureaucratic ineptitude, and I think it also demonstrates the fact that now within the United States, you had that one window of opportunity in which the U.S. was going to focus on Latin America, and that window is closed, and unfortunately it closed around, and so now no one's actually trying to respin it, even though there are very well-intentioned people who can't. Question there.
Wow. I want to ask you a question about a national security question regarding Iran, but we're beating up the U.S. quite a bit here, so I'm going to defend us a little bit.
I was sort of defending the U.S. there.
Well, okay. I was an FBI agent for 26 years, and I worked in Colombia, Chile, Argentina, and I was a program manager in Mexico for 4 years, working counterterrorism matters. Just a couple things vis-a-vis the banking issue. With all due respect, we have some of the toughest and tightest banking regulations with respect to money laundering in the world, with OFAC at Treasury, and in particular in the wake of 9/11 and the Patriot Act. I think what Latin America needs to look at, I'll just make a couple comments, is, and this worked in Mexico because I worked in Mexico, I was at the U.S. Embassy there for 4 years, is Mexico has shut down the underground banking system, which is the Casa de Cambios. And I think that Latin America needs to look at closing down and creating more transparency and a more formal banking system and shutting down that black market banking system so that the end result of money laundering won't have the negative inflationary impact and so forth that it has on Latin American countries. That's one issue. Number two, on the gun running, you said 90% of the weapons can be traced back to the United States.
They were confiscated.
Those are the traceable weapons.
Yeah.
From a global perspective, you got to understand that the Chinese hand grenades and all the high-power 50 caliber weapons and all that are in the hands of the cartels are coming from international arms traffickers. They're coming from South Africa, Israel, Colombia, China, and a lot of other places. There's no doubt that some of it has been transported from gun shows in the United States, but I think, to be honest and to be candid with you, I think it represents a small percentage of the real cartel weapons in Mexico. Just one other thing, and this is what I'd like to propose to you, is from a national security perspective, what do you think of the presence of and the growing influence of Iran and the Iranian intelligence services in the form of Quds forces as well as the terrorist group closely linked to Iran, which is Hezbollah, in Venezuela, Nicaragua, the tri-border of South America, and its potential negative impact on our national security, as well as that of Latin America? Would any of you have any comments on that?
Well, to the first issue, I think you're dead right. I would rephrase it, though, in Latin American terms, as in general, we do not know how to deal with black markets because of the informalization of our economy. Speaking strictly about Central American countries, in some of the countries, because of the enactment of new legislation, people from medium to small size enterprises, microempresas, they have drifted away from formal economy into informal economy. There is no incentive for them to maintain themselves in a formal economy if they get nothing in return from the state or from the entrepreneurial networks. So that the case in Salvador is quite dramatic. The case in Honduras is even more dramatic. 75% of small enterprises have gone into informality. So that is really a heaven for all kinds of shady operations. Another element is that we have had a very positive and constructive help from Treasury in all of Central American institutions that deal with money laundering controls. And they're mostly called superintendency of banking activities. And yet, we still see the type of illegal operations being blossomed into so many creative ways in which devising formal enterprises that are como negocios de cartón, they are indeed licensed entrepreneurial entities, but they don't exist in practice.
Shell industries.
Okay, shell industries.
Yeah.
They keep taking advantage of any type of successful business operation that they can find to be able to use them as corridors for illegality. And I wouldn't get into the arm issue. I don't know it professionally, but indeed arms keep coming from all over the place into our region, even from Brussels, where the seat of the European Union is. So Central America is still a market for a lot of weaponry that comes from all over the place.
My experience is that when you're dealing with an issue, whether it's the exploitation of children, whether it's money laundering, whether it's drug trafficking, it has to start at the macro level. And by that I mean it has to become a policy legislative issue where the policymakers and the lawmakers pass laws that institutionalize these systems, institutionalize these laws. And that's what the Mexicans have done. You know, people are bashing Calderon, but he's winning the war down there. That's the big secret. He's had a huge impact. He has busted up those cartels. He has knocked out the leadership, and they don't know what to do with their money. They're sitting on houses packed with $100 bills, billions of them, because they can't move it through the underground banking system. And how did that happen in the last 6 years? It happened because they closed down the underground banking system. That's how. And so it comes from, and it happened legislatively. The Congress and the Senate decided to do it. So it has to start from the policymakers and the lawmakers and then dribble down. It becomes law.
Let me just say a few words on, I'll just pick up on that point quickly, and I agree with you. And we, not to plug our issue from 2 years ago, but we, in this issue, we did a whole series of all the drug networks from basically Colombia, Venezuela, up to the United States, and who the basic capos were, were the individual. And it's funny, if you look at this list was from 2 years ago. If you look at it now, about 3/4 of them have been killed and decapitated. Figuratively speaking, not literally, although it clearly happens a little too often in Mexico. So I agree with you. I just want to add a few points. On the money laundering, the Center for Global Financial Integrity did a study, came out a little less than a year ago, that looked at the ways in which money is transferred, drug profits rather, are returned to the country. And it isn't actually sort of transfer of money through an ATM machine or wire or whatever. It's actually what's called trade mispricing, where you trade through a third country and you inflate the price of the goods and then you transfer that to the country. And so, and that's often done. And we, in the United States, and I'm not blaming the United States, it's difficult to get a handle on because it's through a third trading partner. So it's not financial transactions. It's actually mispricing a trade. Last thing on the Iran thing, which I have written about, and I'll talk very quickly about. It is true that the Iranians have stepped up their presence. It is true that Hezbollah has actually been active for a long time in the tri-border area between Paraguay, Brazil, and Argentina. Hezbollah has had financing operations, Isla Margarita in Venezuela for a while. It's true that Ahmadinejad has now visited the region 3 times. 7? Is it? Well, anyway. But it is true that he's made all sorts of promises in terms of training military, in terms of weapons factories, in terms of all those things. And it is true, in fact, that the Quds, there was some arrangement with Venezuela and the Quds forces to try to get Mexican hackers to break into the U.S. system. A couple of things. First of all, you don't hear about that story much anymore because there really wasn't a lot there. And that's true of a lot of these stories, is that you're hearing a lot, the intent is true, but a lot of this is also, first, Ahmadinejad's desire domestically to look like he still has friends somewhere in the world. Part of this is also Hugo Chavez's desire to look like he can stick his finger in the United States, even just a few, 3-4 hours flight from U.S. borders. And third, a number of candidates who are running for office right now to make it look like the U.S. has been asleep at the switch in not protecting our southern flank. That's not to say this isn't a serious issue. It's not to say that there may not be elements there that could be activated if sort of things became hot with Iran. But there's, if you check into it, there's a lot less than what you'll hear about. And I've written about this and debunked a number of the things that people are saying. There just isn't the evidence there. And it goes to your point about how the U.S. government is doing well. Do you really think the CIA is not paying attention to what Iran's doing south of our border? I mean, there's been all these, they're mining uranium, they've got a weapons plant, it actually looks like a bicycle factory, but it's not. There's missiles in Paraguaná Peninsula, and you look at that and there's no satellite image to back that up. I mean, the CIA is not asleep at the switch. Just a lot of people are making a lot of noise about this, and you've got 2 demagogues, primarily Hugo Chavez and Ahmadinejad, who basically want to see the U.S. sweat. It's real, but it is exaggerated.
I have a question to Mr. Ward. Can I?
Yes, please. Let's have a discussion.
It struck me the image you used of those gang members who have aged and want to be decommissioned, so to speak, want to leave the organization. Because I ran into an anecdote in San Salvador last week when I was there, that one of the major leaders of Mara Salvatrucha came to one of the organizers of a program financed by the soccer team Real Madrid, who is one of the foremost soccer teams in the world. And they have done this in several countries of Latin America, that they create programs to train youngsters, children and adolescents in soccer clubs and organizations. And the message was, don't leave my kids out of the program. The chieftain of Mara Salvatrucha asking the organizers to take their children into account for this program sponsored by the Real Madrid. That is a formidable indication that they indeed are tired of the type of life that they led for several years, because they're already, I guess, in their 40s or something like that. Are there true, solid indications that they might be a shift in their leadership?
That's not an easy question to answer. Yes, there are changes that are occurring right now. The situation in the United States is very different than the situation in the Central American countries that we've talked about. There are much more recruiting efforts that are done in Central America, and it's much more difficult to leave the gangs, 18th Street and MS in Central America. However, there are indications that there's dissension in the ranks. So there are some people that are a few individuals who want to maintain control and not let people leave, and to try to even make connections to organized crime and build up the gangs and organization. And then there are others that reach that stage where they see that they want a new life. They want something better. And I think one of the things that the reason that I had pictures of older gang members with children is that starting families is one of the big motivators for gang members to realize that they don't want their children to live the same lives to suffer the same way that they did. And so having families, going to the church and getting into drug rehab, and then of course employment is essential. And this gets into Virginia's building partnerships between public and private sector, that without jobs, it makes it extremely difficult for these people to get off of the streets and into the workplace.
With that, we'll conclude. I know there are more questions, but I think the panelists will be sticking around, so you'll have a chance to talk to them again. Thank you all for coming, and join me in thanking our panelists.